Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we're doing more. A Testament of Hope, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Today we're getting into the interviews that Dr. King had. So the first one we're going to be reading is the Kenneth B. Clark interview. Kenneth Clark was himself deeply involved in Dr. King's struggle. As a noted black child psychologist and educator, he used his skills to provide psychological data and to support the civil rights activists' claim that segregated education was psychologically debilitating for black youth and made white youth culturally parochial and socially isolated. His own head note to his interview with Dr. King provides a helpful insight into the setting for this conversation. Dr. Clark was quite adept in this interview, getting Dr. King to talk about his own feelings about facing death threatening situations. He unfortunately did not state when his interview took place, but it appears to have been prior to the 28th of August, 1963 march on Washington. That's the blurb. So, Martin Luther King was interviewed on a day when he had already spent 3 hours taping another television program. When he called for him at his hotel, he seemed weary, but desirous of hiding this fact. In the way to the studio, he talked generally about developments on the various civil rights fronts. He seemed particularly optimistic that a solid and workable agreement was going to be implemented in Birmingham. His tone before the interview was the same as his tone during the interview, a calm, quiet, confident belief in the future. This observer has no doubts that Martin Luther King's philosophy of love for the oppressor is a genuine aspect of his being. He personally does not differentiate between this philosophy and the effectiveness of the nonviolent direct action approach to the attainment of racial justice, which he personifies and leads. For him, the philosophy is not just a strategy, it is a truth. It is his assertion of the philosophical position that one cannot differentiate means from ends. The quiet, contemplative, at times exasperatingly academic style is truly King. He is the paradox of the scholar and the effective man of social action. Martin Luther King is a quietly pleasant young man. There is little about his personal appearance that suggests the firm, courageous leader of public demonstrations. There is no way that he could tell by looking at him that he was or he has exposed himself repeatedly to death, and that by sheer force of his personality and the depth of his convictions has moved the South and the North. He is the embodiment of that dignity which is essential for every man. Clark. In December of 1965, an event in Montgomery, Alabama, catapulted a young man into the national and international prominence. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. led an effective Montgomery bus boycott wherein the Negro people of that city stated for the entire world the fact that they were no longer content with second class citizenship. Since that time, Dr. King has personified that dignity, that discipline, and that insistence upon the rights of an American citizen with the present thrust of the Negro people represents. Dr. King, I know that people throughout America have watched your leadership in the Birmingham situation. Before we talk about those problems, which have gotten the headlines and coverage in all our mass media, I'd like to know a little about you as a person. Where were you born? Something about your family, brothers and sisters, and things of that sort. King. Yes, well, I was born in the South, in Atlanta, Georgia, and I lived there all of my early years. In fact, I went to the public schools of Atlanta, and I went to college in Atlanta. I left after college to attend theological school. Clark, which college did you go to? King, Morehouse College in Atlanta. Clark, part of the Atlanta University system? King, that's right. And I was raised in the house of a minister. My father pastors at the Ebenezer Church in Atlanta and has pastored this church for 33 years. I am now co-pastor of the same church with him. And there's a family of 3 children in the immediate family. I have 1 brother and 1 sister. Clark, is your brother a pastor also? King, yes, he is. He's the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Birmingham, Alabama. Clark, and you have a sister? King, yes, she's in Atlanta teaching at Spelman College. Clark, how about your own immediate family? I remember the last time we were together in Montgomery, you had a son who had just been born before the Montgomery disturbances. King, well, that was a daughter. The second child was a son, but our first child was a daughter. Since that time, we've had 2 more. So we have 4 children now, 2 sons and 2 daughters. The most recent one being the daughter that came 9 weeks ago. Clark, how wonderful. It seems as if you have the children at times of major crises. King, yes, that's right. And that brings new life to life. Clark, very good. You went from Morehouse to Boston University to study philosophy, am I correct? King, well, no. I went from Morehouse to Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, and then I went to went from Crozer to Boston University. Clark. In Boston, you studied philosophy, and if I remember correctly, you have a PhD in philosophy. King. Well, the actual field is philosophical theology. Clark. Now, if we could shift a little from the education within the academic halls to your education in the community. I look at our newspapers and see that you have not only engaged in and led many of these demonstrations, but you have paid for this by seeing the inside of many jails. I've wondered, how many jails have you been to as a result of your involvement in this direct action, nonviolent insistence upon the rights of Negroes? King. Well, I've been arrested 14 times since we started out in Montgomery. Some have been in the same jail. That is, I've been in some jails more than once. I haven't calculated the number of different jails. I would say about 8 of them were different jails. I remember once within 8 days, I transferred to 3 different jails within the state of Georgia. I think I've been to about 8 different jails and I've been arrested about 14 times. Clark, have you attempted to make a study of these jails? For example, the type of jail, the type of individuals you've met in these jails as keepers, say, or wardens. What type of human beings are these in, or are they different types of human beings? King, well, I have gone through the process of comparing the various jails. I guess this is one of those inevitable things that you find yourself doing to kind of lift yourself from the dull monotony of sameness when you're in jail, and I find that they do differ. I've been in some new jails and I've been in some mighty old ones. In the recent jail experience in Birmingham, I was in the new jail. The city jail is about a year old, I think, and in Albany, Georgia, the last year I was in a very old jail. In Fulton County, Georgia, I was in a very new one. Clark, what about the human beings who are the jail keepers? What about the attitude toward you as a person? King, well, they vary also. I've been in jails where the jailers were exceptionally courteous and they went out of their way to see that everything went all right where I was concerned. On the other hand, I have been in jails where the jailers were exceptionally harsh and vitriolic in their words and in their manners. I haven't had any experience of physical violence from jailers, but I've had violence of words from them. Even in Birmingham, for the first few days, some of the jailers were extremely harsh in their statements. Clark, have you ever been in an integrated jail in the South? King, no, that's one experience I haven't had yet. Clark, well, maybe after we get through integrating public accommodations, the last thing will be to integrate the jailhouses. King, yes. Clark, I am very much interested in the philosophy of nonviolence, and particularly, I would like to understand more clearly for myself the relationship between the direct action nonviolence technique, which you have used so effectively, and your philosophy of, for want of better words, I'll use, love of the oppressor. King. All right, Clark. Dr. King, what do you see as the relationship between the two things, which which could be seen as separate? King. Yes, I think so. One is a method of action. Nonviolent direct action is a method of acting to rectify a social situation that is unjust, and it involves in engaging in the practical technique that nullifies the use of violence or calls for nonviolence at every point. That is, you don't use physical violence against the opponent. Now, the love ethic is another dimension which goes into the realm of accepting nonviolence as a way of life. There are many people who will accept nonviolence as the most practical technique to be used in a social situation, but they would not go to the point of seeing the necessity of accepting nonviolence as a way of life. Now, I accept both. I think the nonviolent resistance is the most potent weapon available to oppress people in their struggle for freedom and human dignity. It has a way of disarming the opponent. It exposes his moral defenses. It weakens his morale, and at the same time, it works on his conscience. He just doesn't know how to handle it, and I have seen this over and over again in our struggle in the South. Now, on the question of love or the love ethic, I think this is so important because hate is injurious to the hater and as well as the hated. Many of the psychiatrists are telling us now that many of the strange things that happen in the subconscious and many of the inner conflicts are rooted in hate. And so they are now saying love or perish. Eric Fromm can write a book like The Art of Loving and make it very clear that love is the supreme unifying principle of life. And I'm trying to say in this movement that it is necessary to follow the technique of nonviolence as the most potent weapon available to us. But it is necessary also to follow the love ethic, which becomes a force of personality integration. Clark. But it is not too much to expect that a group of human beings who have also been the victims of cruelty and flagrant injustice could actually love those who have been associated with the perpetrators, if not the perpetrators themselves. How could you expect, for example, the Negroes in Birmingham who know Bull Connor to really love him in any meaningful sense? King. Well, I think one has to understand the meaning of love at this point. I'm certainly not speaking of an affectionate response. I think it is really nonsense to urge oppressed peoples to love their oppressors in an affectionate sense. And I often call on the Greek language to aid me at this point because there are three words in the Greek for love. One is eros, which is sort of an aesthetic or romantic love. Another is philia, which is sort of an intimate affection between personal friends. This is friendship. It is a reciprocal love, and on this love level, you love those people that you like. And then the Greek language comes out with the word agape, which is understanding, creative, redemptive, good for all men. It goes far beyond an affectionate response. Now, when I say to you, Clark, that form means really understanding. King. Yes, that's right. And you come to the point of being able to love the person that does an evil deed in the sense of understanding, and you can hate the deed that the person does. And I'm certainly not talking about eros, I'm talking about friendship. I find it pretty difficult to like people like Bull Connor. I find it difficult to like Senator Eastman. But I think you can love where you can't like the person because life is an affectionate quality. Clark. Yes, I have admired your ability to feel this, and must say to you also that as I read your expounding of the philosophy of love, I found myself often feeling personally quite inadequate. Malcolm X, one of the most articulate exponents of the black Muslim philosophy, has said of your movement and your philosophy that it plays into the hands of the white oppressors, that they are happy to hear you talk about love for the oppressor because this disarms the Negro and fits into the stereotype of the Negro as a meek, turning the other cheek sort of creature. Would you care to comment on Mr. X's beliefs? King. Well, I don't think of love as in this context as emotional bosh. I don't think of it as a weak force, but I think of love as something strong and that organizes itself into powerful direct action. Now, this is what I try to teach in this struggle in the South, that we are not engaged in a struggle that means we sit down and do nothing, that there is a great deal of difference between non resistance to evil and non-violent resistance. Non resistance leaves you in a state of stagnant passivity and deadly complacency, where nonviolent resistance means that you do resist in a very strong and determined manner. And I think some of the criticisms of nonviolence, or some of the critics, fail to realize that we are talking about something very strong, and they confuse non-resistance with non-violent resistance. Clark. He goes beyond that in some of the things I've heard him say. To say that this is deliberately your philosophy of love of the oppressor, which he identifies completely with the nonviolent movement. He says this philosophy and this movement are actually encouraged by whites because it makes them comfortable. It makes them believe that Negroes are meek, supine creatures. King. Well, I don't think that's true. If anyone has ever lived in a nonviolent movement in the South, from Montgomery on through the Freedom Rides and through the sit in movement and the recent Birmingham movement, and seeing the reactions of many of the extremists and reactionaries in the white community, they wouldn't say that this philosophy makes them comfortable. I think it arouses a sense of shame within them often. In many instances, I think it does something to touch the conscience and establish a sense of guilt. Now, so often, people respond to guilt by engaging more in the guilt evoking act in an attempt to drown the sense of guilt. But this approach doesn't make the white man feel comfortable. I think it does the other thing. It disturbs his conscience and it disturbs this sense of contentment that he's had. Clark. James Baldwin raises another point of the whole nonviolent position and approach. He does not reject it in the ways that Malcolm X does, but he raises the question of whether it will be possible to contain the Negro people within this framework of nonviolence if we continue to have more of the kinds of demonstrations that we had in Birmingham, wherein police brought dogs to attack human beings. What is your reaction to Mr. Baldwin's anxiety? King. Well, I think these brutal methods used by the Birmingham police force and other police forces will naturally arouse the ire of the Negroes, and I think there is the danger that some will be so aroused that they will retaliate with violence. I think, though, that we can be sure that the vast majority of Negroes who engage in the demonstrations and who understand the nonviolent philosophy will be able to face dogs and all of the other brutal methods that are used without retaliating with violence because they understand that one of the first principles of nonviolence is the willingness to be the recipient of violence while never inflicting violence upon another. And none of the demonstrators in Birmingham engaged in aggressive or retaliatory violence. It is always someone on the sideline who has never been in the demonstration and probably not in the mass meetings and has never been in a nonviolent workshop. So I think it will depend on the extent to which we can extend the teaching of the philosophy of nonviolence to the larger community rather than those who are engaged in the demonstrations. Clark. Well, how do you maintain this type of discipline, control, and dignity in your followers who do participate in the demonstrations? You don't have police force and you have no uniform. Um, you're not an authoritarian organization. You're a group of people who are voluntarily associated. How do you account for this? I would say beautiful dignity and discipline. King. Well, we do a great deal in terms of teaching both the theoretical aspects of nonviolence as well as the practical application. We even have courses where we go through the experience of being roughed up, and this kind of sociodrama has proved very helpful in preparing those who are engaged in demonstrations. The other thing is, Clark, does this mean, does this even include the children? King. Yes, it includes the children. In Birmingham, where we had some as young as 7 years old to participate in the demonstrations, and they were in the workshops. In fact, none of them went out for a march, none of them engaged in any of the demonstrations before going through this kind of teaching session. So that through this method, this kind of teaching session, so that through this method we are able to get this meaning of nonviolence over. And I think there is a contagious quality in the movement like this when everybody talks about the nonviolence and being faithful to it and being dignified in your resistance. It tends to get over to the larger group because this becomes a part of the vocabulary of the movement. Clark, what is the relationship between your movement and such organizations as the NAACP, CORE, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee? They're separate organizations, but do you work together? King, yes, we do. As you say, each of these organizations is autonomous, but we work together in many, many ways. Last year, we started a voter registration drive and intensified voter registration drive. And all of the organizations are working together. Sometimes two or three are working together at the same community. The same thing is true with our direct action programs in Birmingham. We had the support of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and CORE, and the NAACP. CORE sent some of its staff members in to assist us, and SNCC sent some of its staff members. Roy Wilkins came down to speak in one of the mass meetings and to make it clear that even though the NAACP cannot operate in Alabama, we had the support of the NAACP. So we are all working together in a very significant way. And we are doing even more in the days ahead to coordinate our efforts. Clark, is there any machinery? Does machinery for coordination actually exist now? King, well, we have had a sort of coordinating council where we get together as often as possible. Of course, we get involved in many of our programs in the various areas and can't make as many of these meetings as we'd like, but we often come together. I mean, the heads of all these organizations to try to coordinate our various efforts. Clark, what about the federal government? Have you made any direct appeal either in your own right or as a part of a leadership group, to have a more active involvement in the federal government in the rights of Negroes? King: Yes, I have. I've made appeals, and other members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference have appealed to the president and the new administration generally to do more in dealing with the problem of racial injustice. I think Mr. Kennedy has done some significant things in civil rights, but I do not feel that he has yet given the leadership that the enormity of the people demands. Clark: By Mr. Kennedy, now, do you mean the president? King: Yes, I'm speaking now of the president mainly, and I would include the attorney general. But I think both of these men are men of genuine goodwill, but I think they must understand more about the depths and dimensions of the problem, and I think there is a necessity now to see the urgency of the moment. There isn't a lot of time. Time is running out, and the Negro is making a palpably clear that he wants all of his rights, that he wants them here, and he wants them now. Clark: Is this not considered by some people an extremist position? That is, not really practical. King: Yes, I'm sure many people feel this, but I think they must see the truth of the situation. The shape of the world today does not afford us the luxury of slow movement, and the Negro's quest for dignity and self respect doesn't afford the nation this kind of slow movement. Clark: Dr. King, what do you think will be the outcome of the present confrontation, the present insistence of the Negro for their rights as American citizens without equivocation and without qualification? Do you think this will be obtained? King: I do. Realism impels me to admit that there will be difficult days ahead. In some of the hardcore states in the South, we will confront resistance. There will be resistance and there will be very real problems in the North as a result of the twin evils of employment and housing discrimination. But I think are forces at work now that will somehow ward off all these ominous possibilities. The rolling tide of world opinion will play a great part in this. I think the aroused conscience of many, many white people all over the country, the growing awareness of religious institutions that have not done their job, and the determination of the Negro himself, um, and the growing industrialization of the South. All of these things, I believe, will conjoin to make it possible for us to move on toward the goal of integration. Clark: So you are hopeful? King: Yes, I am. Clark: And I thank you for your hope, and I thank you for your actions. King: Thank you. But yeah, it was an interview by Kenneth B. Clark from the Negro protest, um, Boston Press, 1963. So, yeah, Dr. King, in a live interview with Kenneth Clark, explaining how he does things, how he feels about things, and why he does them. Really trying to put out there beyond just speeches, beyond just essays. It's like, I want to explain this well. And so he answers these questions to really help everybody understand. But yeah, that'll be the end of this episode. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Remember those who do work in the public and be nice to people. Until next time, later.